May I now invite the second keynote speaker, Matt Kovac, Executive Director of Food Industry Asia in Singapore, for his comments.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. My name is Matt. I'm the Executive Director at Food Industry Asia, and I'm representing the private sector. We're a regional association based in Singapore, and we represent some 40 rather large multinational food and beverage companies, as well as Asian corporates as well. Just to clarify, I'm not a researcher, I'm not an economist, I'm not a PhD, and my presentation is just going to talk a little bit about perhaps what the private sector is doing and what they're thinking. So these are some of the things that are being discussed, of course. Well, you're discussing them, but also some of the senior executives at the multinationals. Things around, of course, greater urbanization, more energy-dense diets, divergent political interests, and that relates to trade, and there's a big G20 summit today with Trump and Xi Jinping, the rise of obesity and persistent undernutrition, some of the R&D drivers in the agricultural sector, but also in food, and transparency and sustainability in Asia's food systems. I would say one thing, it's sort of, depending on which spectrum you are, the food system right now, a lot of people say it's broken, but in many ways it's rather efficient. And what do I mean by that? Perhaps for middle income and upper income people, they can afford nutritious and healthier foods. Bottom of the pyramid, they can't. Because of that, there's been a lot of distrust, an erosion of trust with big food. And they are listening and they are hearing, but unfortunately, perhaps from your perspective, they're not moving fast enough to address that. And that's why we have 800 million people who are undernourished and 2.5 billion people that are obese and overweight. So what is the private sector trying to do? Well, in this part of the world, it might actually be getting a little bit worse in many ways. There are more calories going to be consumed. There's going to be more demand for animal-based proteins and fats, but the increase in processed foods as well, because there's a massive growth market here in Asia with approximately, 4 to 4.5 billion consumers across the whole Asia-Pacific. So with that in mind, what the food companies are looking at in terms of R&D and innovation, there are a number of different things. These range from how are they making processed foods a little healthier. Okay, so with the whole reformulation drive that's been driven by some of the introductions of soda taxes and other types of taxes in the UK, but also in Thailand, so that's put pressure on the companies to reformulate, but that's kind of incremental innovation. But there are a number of different areas that the private sector are looking at, and these range from how do they use big data and AI, to give them more insights about how to produce the right type of food for middle and upper income, but also how do they address that bottom of the pyramid as well. New trends around plant-based proteins and cellular agriculture. This is a big drive at the moment from the private sector. And when I say the private sector, it's also venture capital, private equity, and philanthropy as well. How are they using more traditional ingredients in Asia as well, rather than using the standard commodities that they've been used to using? But essentially, within this circle, they are trying to look at how to make foods more nutritious, sustainable, a little bit more appealing, of course, accessible and affordable, but ultimately for those big food companies, it has to be mass scale as well for them to really, truly be interested in it. So rather than me talk about sort of financing mechanisms, I'm going to say sort of how is the private sector channeling some of its investment, and I'm going to give an example here. So in Singapore, there's a concentration of regional headquarters for the big food companies, agribusiness, and others across the supply chain. So what's happening right now is the Singapore government is trying to create this food ecosystem where they're actually trying to share some data and test bed some new products in that market. Now, I have to say that perhaps that's not being addressed at the lower end, at the bottom of the pyramid right now. But they're trying to create a thriving R&D community and a place for new ideas to be generated. And then how are they supporting that growth? And in particular, how are they harnessing the power of startups and SMEs? So for an organization like FIA, where traditionally we've been working with the big multinationals, increasingly now, as part of our membership, we're embracing SMEs and also startup companies to look at how we produce some of those new foods for the future. So one thing that we're working on with the Singapore government and across the chain with the food companies is building this knowledge base. And perhaps here this is an area where I'd ask for the research community, but also policymakers to really truly engage with the private sector. Because as I understand from the conference for the last few days, there aren't too many private sector representatives here, which I think is a shame. I understand some of the sensitivities that many of you might have engaging with certain individual companies, but nevertheless, it's absolutely essential for you to understand the private sector and where they're putting their R&D and investment into these new types of food products and elsewhere. So this knowledge base is being built with some of the research institutes in Singapore, like A-Star, as well as the academic institutes as well. And one ask is looking at how we generate some new consumer insights as well. And I was quite pleased to see the IFPRI paper on urbanization and looking at how they can access some of that data, which is traditionally has been quite difficult to access. And the second part of this is also driving that co-innovation. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean just developing products, but it does mean creating that ecosystem where all the stakeholders and parties come together to say, how are we trying to solve some of those issues from the research perspective, but also from venture capitalists who are willing to put money into some of these new foods, and private equity as well. And there's an amazing amount of investment that is going into some of these new types of food, in particular around plant-based and cellular agriculture. And one conversation yesterday in Singapore with the VC is how they see these new foods in cellular agriculture. Right now, perhaps it costs, say, $5 to produce a kilo of beef. Right now with cellular agriculture, it costs $5,000 to produce that 1 kilo of beef. But the rate of change in the way that they're trying to get the price down, perhaps over the next 5 to 10 years, that could be an area where it feeds greater demand for animal-based proteins rather than from traditional rearing of livestock and from that way. So a lot of investment is going into that, and I really would encourage the research community to really start engaging with some of these different stakeholders to understand what the implications are. The fourth part of this is infrastructure. Okay, if a company is going to produce the next generation of food products that are going to be healthier and more nutritious, then you need the direct type of infrastructure to actually test bed these products. It's not as simple as saying, let's just make this product nutritious and accessible and affordable. You really have to test this out. And for some of the bigger companies, sometimes this is a really big challenge, okay? Sometimes there can be a bit of inertia in big companies to change. There's a lot of vested interest sometimes in those companies as well. But how they're looking at it, where they can't do it themselves, how are they harnessing some of the startups and SMEs to do that work on their behalf and grow those new markets and with those new types of food, and test bedding that product in a pilot facility in Singapore. But also what we're talking to other governments as well, in Thailand, in China, and Indonesia as well. And then the fourth aspect of this is, how do you really create that disruptive technology? How do you really allow some of those companies to get access to market? You know, maybe through traditional methods or perhaps novel ways of doing this. And right now, that's kind of what we're trying to figure out a little bit as well. We don't have any sort of concrete answers how to do that. But perhaps I can give one example about China and how things are changing. So when it comes to e-commerce, many of the VCs who invested into this, so you know, as Alibaba, Lazada, and Redmart across the region, what they're saying is that e-commerce will just be commerce in the future. And what you have with Chinese consumers, not necessarily just Generation Z or millennials, but just in general, they're purchasing fresh and packaged foods through e-commerce channels because they trust that food through that channel more than a traditional method. So what's the opportunity then for some of these new food products to actually sell through those new channels in places like China as well? And I think perhaps my final note is to say that you really do need to engage with the private sector. I know there's some resistance, okay? I mean, I'd like to say that some of you I know here from the FAO and from IFPRI and others, we've had some honest discussions about this, but perhaps through this sort of new, this kind of ecosystem that we're trying to grow, there is an opportunity for policymakers and researchers to understand the private sector and what some of the challenges they have, but also look at what SMEs and startup companies are doing as well as the venture capitalists, private equity, private investors that are actually channeling hundreds of millions of dollars into this sector now, which is ripe for disruption. So thank you.